Queen Zarathus had ruled the Vicani Empire for 3 decades, without ever seeing a single star. Born blind into the most powerful alien dynasty in the galaxy, she commanded fleets that could shatter worlds and armies that numbered in the billions. Her people, tall humanoids with crystalline skin that shifted colors with emotion, had conquered 47 star systems through pure military might. Yet for all her power, Zarathus had never experienced the simple pleasure of watching a sunset. The Vicani saw blindness as a divine gift. Their ancient texts spoke of rulers who could see beyond the physical realm, perceiving truths hidden from those cursed with sight. Zarathus had cultivated this mystique, using her enhanced hearing and intuition to appear almost prophetic in her decision-making. Her advisors whispered that she could hear the heartbeats of liars across a crowded throne room, and they were not entirely wrong. When the humans first made contact, the Vicani military wanted to crush them immediately. These strange soft-skinned bipeds from a backwater world called Earth seemed laughably primitive. They had barely mastered faster-than-light travel and possessed no weapons that could threaten even a single Vicani destroyer. General Korath, Zarathus's most trusted commander, argued for a quick conquest that would add the Sol system to their empire within a month. But something about the human transmission intrigued the queen. Ambassador Sarah Chen spoke with a calm confidence that reminded Zarathus of herself. The human woman's voice carried no fear, despite knowing she addressed an empire that could reduce her world to atoms. Instead, Chen proposed something unprecedented: a diplomatic marriage between species to forge an alliance that would benefit both civilizations. The idea scandalized the Vicani court. Marriage between species was not merely unusual. It was considered impossible. Vicani physiology, culture, and lifespan differed dramatically from humans. Most shocking of all, Chen had specifically requested to meet with any unwed Vicani royalty, seemingly unaware that their queen had never taken a mate due to her blindness. Traditional Vicani custom demanded that royal marriages be celebrated with elaborate visual ceremonies that the queen could never fully participate in. Zara thus found herself curious about these humans in ways that disturbed her usual calculated demeanor. She had ruled through fear and respect, never allowing personal emotions to cloud her judgment. Yet something in Chen's voice suggested these beings possessed qualities her empire lacked. The humans had survived on a world that seemed determined to kill them, developing technologies through cooperation rather than conquest. Their preliminary reports spoke of art, music, and literature that served no military purpose yet consumed vast amounts of their resources. Against all advice from her council, Zarathus agreed to meet with a human delegation. The decision sent shockwaves through the empire. Some saw it as weakness, others as brilliance. The queen herself wasn't entirely sure which interpretation was correct. The human ship that arrived at her capital world was tiny compared to Vicani vessels, barely larger than a courier craft. Its design emphasized efficiency over intimidation, another alien concept to a species that measured worth through displays of power. When the delegation disembarked, Zarathus waited in her private audience chamber rather than the grand throne room, curious to experience these beings without the distraction of ceremonial pageantry. Dr. Marcus Webb was nothing like what she had expected. Standing barely 6 feet tall, he possessed none of the physical presence that Vicani culture associated with leadership. His voice, however, carried depths that immediately captured her attention. When he spoke, she heard layers of meaning that suggested intelligence and compassion in equal measure. Unlike her own subjects, who carefully modulated their words to avoid giving offense, Webb spoke with genuine warmth and humor. The preliminary negotiations were supposed to last 3 days. They stretched into 2 weeks as Zarathus found herself extending the discussions to learn more about human culture. Webb described colors she could never see, painting word pictures of Earth's blue skies and green forests that fascinated her in ways she couldn't explain. He spoke of human music, art, and poetry with a passion that made her crystalline skin shimmer with emotional resonance. More intriguingly, Webb never once mentioned her blindness or treated it as a limitation. He seemed to understand instinctively that she perceived the world differently, adapting his descriptions without making her feel deficient. When she asked about human customs surrounding disability, he explained their concept of accommodation rather than adaptation, describing a society that changed itself to include everyone, rather than expecting individuals to conform to existing limitations. The turning point came during their final scheduled meeting. Webb had brought recordings of human music, including compositions written specifically for individuals with various disabilities. As the haunting melody of a piece composed by a blind human musician filled the chamber, Zarathus felt something shift inside her carefully constructed emotional defenses. For the first time in her life, she encountered another being who understood that blindness was not an absence, but a different way of experiencing existence. Webb didn't pity her or treat her as mystically gifted. He simply accepted her as she was while showing genuine interest in her perspectives and experiences. When General Korath interrupted the session with urgent military reports, Zarathus realized how much she had come to value these conversations. The general's presence reminded her of the vast gulf between human and Vicani cultures. Her people respected strength, feared her power, and obeyed her commands. But they had never simply enjoyed her company the way this strange human seemed to. That evening, alone in her chambers, Zarathus made a decision that would alter the course of both civilizations. She would accept the human proposal for a diplomatic marriage, but not with just any suitable candidate. She would propose to Dr. Marcus Webb himself, the first being she had ever met who made her forget about the darkness behind her eyes. The choice terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She had commanded armies and conquered worlds, but she had never taken such a personal risk. If Webb rejected her proposal, she would face humiliation unlike anything in her 3 decades of rule. If he accepted, she would be venturing into completely unknown territory, binding her fate to a being whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about connection and understanding. As her skin shifted through colors that reflected her tumultuous emotions, Queen Zarathus began planning the most important negotiation of her life. Dr. Marcus Webb stared at the quantum communicator display, reading Queen Zarathus's proposal for the 5th time. The diplomatic message was formally worded, but he could sense the personal vulnerability beneath the official language. The most powerful being in the known galaxy was asking him, a xenobiologist from Earth, to marry her and forge an alliance between their species. His colleagues at the embassy thought he had lost his mind when he announced his intention to accept. Ambassador Chen pulled him aside for a heated discussion about the implications. Human-alien marriages existed only in science fiction, and the biological challenges alone seemed insurmountable. The Vicani lived for over 300 years. Their crystalline skin could withstand temperatures that would kill humans instantly, and their emotional expressions were completely visual, through color changes that Marcus could observe but never truly comprehend. More troubling were the political ramifications. Earth's government had authorized diplomatic contact, not the marriage of one of their citizens to an alien empress. The Vicani Empire controlled resources that could either elevate humanity to unprecedented prosperity or reduce their world to cosmic dust. If the marriage failed or caused offense, the consequences could be catastrophic for the entire human species. Despite these concerns, Marcus found himself drawn to the idea in ways that surprised him. During their 2 weeks of negotiations, he had glimpsed something extraordinary beneath Queen Zarathus's imperial facade. Her blindness had forced her to develop incredible perceptual abilities, but, more importantly, it had given her a perspective on existence that fascinated him as both a scientist and a human being. The Queen understood isolation in ways that resonated with his own experiences. As one of the few humans who had dedicated his life to studying alien biology, Marcus had always felt like an outsider among his own species. His passion for xenobiology was considered eccentric at best, and his theories about interspecies communication had been largely dismissed by the scientific community, until first contact proved their relevance. Zarathus seemed to recognize this shared sense of being different. During their conversations, she had asked insightful questions about his research and shown genuine curiosity about human approaches to scientific discovery. Unlike the Vicani military leaders who viewed everything through the lens of conquest and power, the Queen appreciated knowledge for its own sake. The response he sent back was simple and direct. He accepted her proposal, but with conditions that would protect both their peoples and their personal well-being. The marriage would begin as a diplomatic arrangement with clearly defined boundaries, allowing both of them to maintain their individual identities while exploring the possibility of genuine partnership. The journey to the Vicani capital world took 3 weeks. Aboard a specially modified human vessel, Marcus used the time to study Vicani culture, physiology, and social customs with an intensity that impressed even his diplomatic escort. He learned that Vicani marriages were typically arranged based on genetic compatibility and political advantage, with personal affection considered a pleasant bonus rather than a requirement. More importantly, he discovered that the queen's blindness held deep spiritual significance in Vicani society. Ancient texts described blind rulers as bridges between the physical and spiritual realms, capable of perceiving truths that escaped those limited by sight. The mythology suggested that such rulers would eventually find partners who could help them see the world in new ways, creating a balance between perception and vision. When Marcus finally arrived at the Vicani capital, he was struck by the sheer scale of their civilization. The city stretched across an entire continent, its crystalline architecture reaching toward the sky in impossible spirals and geometric patterns. Everything was designed for beings who communicated through color and light, creating a visual symphony that was simultaneously beautiful and alien to human sensibilities. Queen Zarathus met him in her private gardens. Away from the formal protocols of the imperial court, she moved through the space with fluid grace, her fingers trailing along textured pathways that guided her movements. Her crystalline skin shimmered with subtle hues that Marcus was beginning to recognize as expressions of curiosity and nervous anticipation. Their first private conversation, as an engaged couple, was awkward and formal. Both were acutely aware that their every word was being monitored by security systems and probably analyzed by intelligence agencies from both civilizations. The weight of expectation from billions of beings across 2 species created a pressure that made genuine interaction nearly impossible. The breakthrough came when Marcus accidentally knocked over a ceremonial water feature while gesturing. During an explanation of human courtship customs, the sound of rushing water and his embarrassed apology made Zarathus laugh, a melodic sound that caused her skin to shift through colors he had never seen before. In that moment of shared humor, they found a connection that transcended their vast differences. They began taking walks together through the palace gardens, with Marcus describing the visual elements of their surroundings, while Zarathus shared the acoustic and tactile details he was missing. She taught him to identify different materials by touch and showed him how Vicani architecture incorporated sonic elements that created complex auditory landscapes for those who could perceive them. These exchanges revealed the depth of her intelligence and creativity. Despite her blindness, or perhaps because of it, the queen had developed an understanding of space and design that challenged Marcus's assumptions about perception and awareness. She could navigate complex 3-dimensional environments by sound and touch alone, often moving with more precision than sighted individuals. As they spent more time together, Marcus began to appreciate the qualities that had made her an effective ruler. Her enhanced hearing allowed her to detect subtle vocal cues that revealed the true intentions of speakers. She could sense emotional states through changes in breathing patterns and heart rates, giving her an almost supernatural ability to read people's genuine feelings beneath their words. The formal betrothal ceremony took place a week after his arrival, conducted according to ancient Vicani traditions that had been modified to accommodate human participation. Marcus wore ceremonial robes that incorporated both human and Vicani design elements, while Zarathus appeared in traditional royal garments that shifted colors in response to her emotions throughout the proceedings. The ceremony itself was unlike anything in human experience. Vicani marriages involved a complex ritual of color displays and harmonic resonances that created a synesthetic experience combining sight, sound, and even taste. Marcus could only partially perceive the full ceremony, but what he could experience was overwhelmingly beautiful. When they exchanged vows, speaking in both languages, Marcus realized that something unexpected was happening. What had begun as a diplomatic arrangement was evolving into something deeper and more complex. The queen's voice carried genuine warmth when she spoke his name, and her skin displayed colors that her advisors later told him indicated affection and hope. As the ceremony concluded, and they prepared for their first night as a married couple, both Marcus and Zarathus understood that they were embarking on an unprecedented journey. They were not just individuals from different species learning to coexist. They were pioneers exploring the possibility of connection across the vast gulf that separated their civilizations. The royal bedchamber was a marvel of Vekani engineering, designed specifically to accommodate Queen Zarathus's unique needs. Textured pathways embedded in the floor guided movement throughout the space, while subtle temperature variations and acoustic dampening created distinct zones for different activities. Marcus spent several minutes exploring the room, marveling at how every surface seemed to serve both functional and aesthetic purposes. Zarathus waited near a series of crystalline panels that hummed with soft harmonics. Her ceremonial robes had been replaced with simpler garments that still managed to complement her natural luminescence. Marcus could see her nervousness in the rapid color shifts across her skin, patterns that reminded him of aurora dancing across polar skies. Neither of them had any precedent for this situation. Vekani royal marriages typically involved partners who had known each other since childhood, individuals who understood every nuance of each other's emotional displays and physical needs. Human relationships developed through completely different patterns of courtship and intimacy. They were literally making up the rules as they went along. Marcus broke the silence first, describing the visual elements of the chamber that had captured his attention. He talked about the way light refracted through the crystalline walls, creating patterns that shifted with the movements of air currents. His voice seemed to relax Zarathus, and her skin gradually settled into steadier, warmer hues. She responded by guiding him through the acoustic properties of the space. By clapping her hands at specific points, she could create resonances that revealed the chamber's dimensions and the placement of furniture. Marcus found himself closing his eyes and following her lead, learning to perceive the room through sound rather than sight. This simple exercise became their first genuine moment of intimacy. As they moved through the space together, Marcus describing colors and light while Zarathus shared sounds and textures, they began to understand how their different sensory experiences could complement, rather than compete with each other. When they finally sat together on the Queen's sleeping platform, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Zarathus spoke about the loneliness of royal life, describing how her blindness had been used to justify keeping her isolated from potential suitors. Most Vekani nobles feared that any children she bore might inherit her condition, despite the fact that her blindness had been caused by a rare genetic mutation rather than hereditary factors. Marcus shared his own experiences with isolation, explaining how his passion for xenobiology had made him an outsider in human society. He had spent years studying theoretical alien cultures while most people considered the possibility of contact to be science fiction. His colleagues had tolerated his research but never truly understood his fascination with the possibility of communication across species barriers. As the night progressed, they discovered unexpected similarities in their approaches to leadership and problem-solving. Both had learned to rely on intuition and careful observation of subtle cues that others might miss. Zarathus used her enhanced hearing to detect deception and emotional states, while Marcus had developed skills in reading behavioral patterns across different species. The physical aspects of their union required careful negotiation and creativity. Vekani physiology was compatible with human biology in unexpected ways, but the differences in size, temperature tolerance, and sensory perception meant that traditional approaches to intimacy needed to be completely reconsidered. Marcus discovered that Vekani's skin was incredibly sensitive to pressure and temperature changes. Light touches that would barely register for humans could create intense sensations for Zarathus. Her crystalline skin conducted heat and cold in ways that allowed for entirely new forms of physical communication. For her part, Zarathus was fascinated by the warmth and softness of human skin. Vekani bodies were naturally cooler and harder, designed for their planet's harsh environmental conditions. Marcus's body heat created a comfort zone that she found unexpectedly soothing, while his more fragile physiology made her acutely aware of the need for gentleness. Their exploration of physical intimacy became an exercise in patience and discovery. Every touch was a small experiment in cross-species communication, requiring constant verbal feedback and adjustment. What emerged was a form of connection that neither of them had experienced before, built on absolute trust and genuine curiosity about each other's experiences. The breakthrough moment came when Marcus began describing the colors that flowed across Zarathus's skin during their interactions. He painted word pictures of the deep blues that seemed to indicate contentment, the warm golds that appeared during moments of pleasure, and the complex patterns that emerged when she experienced multiple emotions simultaneously. Zarathos had never known that her emotional states were visible to others in such detail. The realization that Marcus could literally see her feelings created a vulnerability that was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in her life, she was with someone who could perceive aspects of herself that had always been hidden. In return, she taught him to feel the subtle vibrations that passed through her crystalline skin during emotional changes. These sensations were too faint for most beings to detect, but Marcus's scientific training had given him sensitivity to minute environmental changes. He learned to recognize the tactile signatures of her different emotional states, creating a form of communication that bypassed language entirely. As dawn approached, they lay together in the gentle light that filtered through the chamber's crystal walls. Marcus described the way the rising sun created rainbow patterns across the surfaces, while Zarathos listened to the morning sounds of the palace awakening around them. Neither of them had expected the night to be transformative, but something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. What had begun as a diplomatic arrangement had evolved into a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and fascination. They had not just learned to coexist, they had discovered how their differences could create a stronger whole. The implications extended far beyond their personal relationship. If a human and a Vicani could find such profound connection despite their vast differences, it suggested possibilities for cooperation between their species that neither civilization had previously imagined. When palace servants began their morning duties, Zarathos and Marcus were still awake, talking quietly about the future they might build together. The queen's skin displayed steady patterns of contentment and hope, while Marcus's voice carried a warmth and confidence that had been absent during their formal negotiations. They had taken the first steps into uncharted territory, creating a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. The journey ahead would bring challenges they couldn't yet anticipate, but they would face them together, each using their unique abilities to guide the other through landscapes both foreign and familiar. The first challenge to their union came sooner than either Marcus or Zarathos had anticipated. 3 weeks after their wedding, reports arrived of a rebellion in the Outer Rim territories. The Zorathi, a warrior species that had been conquered by the Vicani 20 years earlier, had seized control of 3 star systems and declared their independence from the Empire. General Korath burst into the Royal Council chamber with news that would have normally demanded immediate military response. Zorathi forces were using guerrilla tactics that the traditional Vicani fleet couldn't counter effectively. Worse, they had somehow acquired advanced weaponry that could punch through Vicani shield technology, suggesting outside support from unknown allies. The general's solution was characteristically direct: mobilize the full Imperial fleet and reduce the rebellious worlds to uninhabitable rocks. It was the standard Vicani approach to insurrection, proven effective across dozens of previous conflicts. The assembled military advisors nodded in agreement, already calculating deployment schedules and resource requirements. Marcus watched the proceedings with growing unease. He had been granted observer status in council meetings, supposedly to provide human perspective on diplomatic matters. But as the discussion progressed, he realized that the Vicani concept of problem-solving was fundamentally different from human approaches. Queen Zarathos listened to the reports with her characteristic stillness, her skin displaying the deep purples that Marcus had learned indicated intense concentration. When General Korath finished his presentation, she asked a series of questions that surprised everyone present. Instead of focusing on military logistics, she wanted to understand why the Zorathi had rebelled now, after 2 decades of apparent compliance. What grievances had driven them to risk everything against impossible odds? How had they acquired advanced weapons? And what did their choice of targets tell them about their strategic goals? The questions revealed a critical gap in Vicani intelligence gathering. Their occupation forces had focused on preventing rebellion, rather than understanding the underlying causes of discontent. They knew how to suppress dissent, but had never bothered to learn what might prevent it from arising in the first place. Marcus found himself speaking before he fully realized what he was doing. He suggested that the rebellion might be a symptom of deeper problems rather than the problem itself. Human history was filled with examples of successful revolts that had occurred when oppressed populations found hope for change. usually through outside support or internal weakness in the ruling power. General Korath's crystalline features shifted through angry reds at the suggestion that Vikani rule might be flawed. He pointed out that humans had barely achieved interstellar travel and were hardly qualified to advise an empire that had conquered 47 star systems. The other military advisors murmured agreement, their skin displaying colors that Marcus was learning to associate with dismissive contempt. But Queen Zarathus held up a hand for silence, her skin showing the golden patterns that indicated genuine interest. She asked Marcus to explain human approaches to similar situations, curious about alternatives to the standard military response. Marcus described how Earth's United Nations had evolved from centuries of devastating conflicts between human nations. Instead of conquest and occupation, they had developed systems for resolving disputes through negotiation, economic incentives, and cultural exchange. The approach wasn't perfect, but it had prevented major wars for over a century, while allowing different human societies to maintain their distinct identities. The concept was revolutionary to the Vikani mindset. Their empire had been built on the principle that superior force justified dominion over weaker peoples. The idea that conquered populations might be willing partners rather than subjugated enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about power and governance. General Korath argued that showing any weakness would encourage more rebellions throughout the empire. The Vikani had maintained order through fear and overwhelming force for centuries. Any deviation from that approach would be seen as weakness and invite chaos across their territories. Marcus countered that true strength might come from voluntary cooperation rather than enforced submission. The energy and resources currently spent on maintaining military occupation could be redirected toward economic development and technological advancement. Allied worlds would be more productive and loyal than conquered ones. The debate continued for hours, with Queen Zarathus listening carefully to both perspectives. Marcus could see her skin cycling through complex patterns that suggested internal conflict between traditional Vikani approaches and the possibilities he was describing. Finally, she made a decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of authorizing the military response that General Korath had requested, she announced her intention to visit the rebellious territories personally. She would meet with Zarathi leaders under a flag of truce to understand their grievances and explore possibilities for peaceful resolution. The reaction was immediate and intense. Every military advisor in the chamber began speaking at once, their skin displaying colors that ranged from panic to outrage. No Vikani ruler had ever negotiated with rebels. The precedent would undermine imperial authority and invite further challenges to their rule. Zarathus remained calm in the face of their opposition, but Marcus could see the subtle tremors in her crystalline skin that indicated enormous stress. She was gambling her throne and possibly her life on an approach that had never been attempted in Vikani history. Marcus stepped forward and volunteered to accompany her on the mission. His presence would demonstrate human support for the peaceful approach while providing an additional perspective on the negotiations. More importantly, he could serve as a witness to whatever they discovered about the rebellion's true nature and goals. The offer created another wave of controversy. Risking the queen's life was dangerous enough, but endangering her human consort could have catastrophic implications for relations between their species. If Marcus was killed or injured, Earth might view it as an act of war despite his voluntary participation. But Zarathus accepted his proposal, recognizing that their partnership could be a powerful symbol of cooperation between different species. If they could demonstrate successful collaboration between human and Vikani approaches to conflict resolution, it might provide a model for integrating rebellious populations into the empire. The preparations for their diplomatic mission required unprecedented coordination between human and Vikani resources. Earth's government reluctantly approved Marcus's participation after extracting promises that every possible precaution would be taken to ensure his safety. The Vikani military worked frantically to develop security protocols for a situation they had never anticipated. As their departure date approached, Marcus and Zarathus spent long hours discussing strategy and contingency plans. They were venturing into completely unknown territory, attempting to solve a problem through methods that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Vikani civilization. The night before they left, Lying together in their shared chambers, both of them understood that they were about to face the first real test of their partnership. Success could revolutionize how the Vekani Empire dealt with internal conflicts and establish a new model for interspecies cooperation. Failure could destroy their marriage, topple the queen from her throne, and potentially trigger a war between their peoples. Marcus traced patterns on Zarathus's crystalline skin, watching the colors shift in response to her turbulent emotions. Her courage in challenging centuries of Vekani tradition impressed him, but he also understood the enormous risks she was taking based partly on his untested theories about human approaches to diplomacy. They were about to discover whether love and understanding could truly bridge the gaps between not just individuals, but entire civilizations locked in conflict. The journey to Zarathi space took them through regions of the galaxy that Marcus had only seen in intelligence reports. As their diplomatic vessel approached the contested systems, he found himself staring at worlds that showed clear signs of military occupation. Orbital defense platforms bristled around each planet, while patrol fleets maintained constant surveillance of shipping lanes and communication networks. Queen Zarathus sat beside him on the observation deck, her enhanced hearing picking up subtle vibrations in the ship's hull that indicated they were being scanned by multiple targeting systems. Her skin displayed the steady blues that Marcus had learned to associate with determined calm, but he could feel the tension in her crystalline form as they passed through increasingly hostile territory. The Zarathi had agreed to meet them at a neutral space station in the buffer zone between Imperial and Rebel space. The facility had been hastily evacuated of civilian personnel, leaving only essential maintenance systems and a small diplomatic staff to oversee the unprecedented negotiations. When they docked, Marcus got his first look at the Zarathi delegation. The rebels were tall, lean humanoids with leathery skin and prominent cranial ridges that gave them a perpetually fierce expression. Their leader, War Chief Thakmor, moved with the predatory grace of a born warrior, but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested there was more to him than simple military prowess. The initial meeting took place in the station's main conference chamber, a sterile environment designed to avoid giving any faction a psychological advantage. Thakmor brought 3 advisors while Zarathus was accompanied by Marcus and a minimal security detail. The contrast between the two groups was stark. The Zarathi radiated barely contained aggression, while the Vekani delegation projected imperial authority tempered by diplomatic caution. The first hours of negotiation were tense and unproductive. Thakmor made it clear that the Zarathi viewed 20 years of Vekani occupation as 20 years of cultural extinction. Their children were being educated in Vekani schools that taught imperial history, while ignoring Zarathi traditions. Their world's resources were being extracted to fuel the empire's expansion, leaving nothing for local development. Most damaging of all, the Vekani had banned traditional Zarathi military service, forcing a warrior culture to abandon the practices that defined their identity. Young Zarathi who would once have competed for honor in ritual combat were instead assigned to menial labor in imperial factories and mines. Queen Zarathus listened to these grievances with growing understanding. Her blindness meant she couldn't see the color displays that typically accompanied Vekani emotional expression, forcing her to focus entirely on the content and tone of speech. This limitation had become an advantage in interspecies negotiations, allowing her to perceive the genuine pain behind Thakmor's anger. Marcus found himself serving as an unexpected translator between the two cultures. When Thakmor described Zarathi warrior traditions, Marcus could draw parallels to human martial arts and military honor codes that helped Zarathus understand their cultural significance. When the Queen explained Vekani administrative practices, Marcus could reframe them in terms that acknowledged Zarathi concerns about autonomy and self-determination. The breakthrough came when Marcus asked Thakmor about the advanced weapons that had enabled the rebellion. The war chief's reaction was immediate and telling. His fierce expression shifted to one of deep concern, and he exchanged worried glances with his advisors. It became clear that the Zarathi had not sought outside help in their rebellion. The weapons had been provided by mysterious benefactors who claimed to support Zarathi independence, but refused to reveal their identities or ultimate goals. The rebels had accepted the aid out of desperation, but Thakmor was beginning to suspect that they were being manipulated by forces with their own agenda. This revelation changed the entire dynamic of the negotiations. Instead of a simple rebellion against imperial rule, they were dealing with a complex situation involving unknown third parties who might be trying to destabilize the entire region. The Zarathi rebellion was potentially just the first move in a larger game being played by enemies of both the Vekani Empire and Zarathi Independence Queen. Zarathus proposed something that astonished everyone present: a joint investigation into the source of the mysterious weapons, followed by negotiations for Zarathi autonomy within a reformed imperial structure. Instead of crushing the rebellion or granting complete independence, she offered a middle path that could address Zarathi grievances while maintaining regional stability. The proposal required both sides to take enormous risks. The Zarathi would have to trust that the Vekani were sincere about reform, rather than simply buying time to prepare a more effective military response. The Vekani would have to accept that their traditional approach to governance had failed and needed fundamental changes. Marcus watched as Thakmor struggled with the decision. The war chief had spent years preparing for a fight to the death against imperial oppression, and the possibility of peaceful resolution challenged everything he thought he knew about Vekani intentions. But the logic of the Queen's proposal was undeniable. Neither the Zarathi nor the Vekani could afford to ignore the threat posed by unknown forces supplying advanced weapons to rebels. After hours of intense discussion among the Zarathi delegation, Thakmor agreed to a temporary ceasefire while joint investigation teams examined the mysterious weapons. Both sides would contribute personnel and resources to determine who was behind the rebellion's military support and what their ultimate goals might be. The agreement also established a framework for ongoing negotiations about Zarathi autonomy. Instead of the complete cultural assimilation that had characterized Vekani occupation, the new arrangement would allow the Zarathi to maintain their traditional practices while contributing their unique skills to imperial defense and exploration. Most significantly, the framework included provisions for other subject species to petition for similar autonomous status. If the Zarathi experiment succeeded, it could provide a model for transforming the entire empire from a collection of conquered territories into a genuine alliance of diverse civilizations. As the initial agreements were being drafted, Marcus found himself amazed by Queen Zarathus's diplomatic skills. Her blindness had forced her to develop extraordinary sensitivity to vocal cues and emotional undertones, allowing her to navigate the complex psychological landscape of the negotiations with remarkable precision. She had correctly identified the moments when Thakmor was genuinely interested versus simply posturing for his advisor's benefit. She had recognized when to push for concessions and when to offer compromises that addressed underlying concerns rather than surface demands. The negotiations established monitoring stations throughout the contested systems, staffed by joint teams of Vekani, Zarathi, and human observers. These facilities would serve multiple purposes: tracking the source of mysterious weapons, ensuring compliance with ceasefire agreements, and providing venues for ongoing diplomatic contact between the species. When they finally departed the neutral station, both Marcus and Zarathus understood that they had accomplished something unprecedented in Vekani history. They had not just prevented a war, they had created a new model for imperial governance that respected the autonomy and dignity of subject peoples, while maintaining the security and stability that benefited all member species. The journey back to the capital world gave them time to process what they had experienced and plan for the challenges ahead. The joint investigation teams would need careful coordination to be effective, while the autonomy negotiations would require delicate balancing of Zarathi desires for self-determination with Vekani concerns about imperial unity. More importantly, they had discovered that their partnership was more than just personal compatibility. Marcus's human perspective on conflict resolution had complemented Zarathus's Vekani understanding of power dynamics, creating a diplomatic approach that neither species could have developed alone. As they prepared to present their agreements to the Imperial Council, both of them knew that they would face significant opposition from traditionalists who preferred familiar military solutions to uncertain diplomatic experiments. But they had proven that cooperation between different species could achieve results that force alone could not accomplish. The joint investigation teams began their work within days of the ceasefire agreement, but what they discovered in the Zarathi weapons caches defied everyone's expectations. The technology was not just advanced, It was completely alien to both Vicani and human understanding. The power sources operated on principles that violated known physics, while the targeting systems incorporated biological components that seemed to be alive. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human xenotechnology specialist assigned to the investigation, contacted Marcus with findings that sent chills through the entire diplomatic mission. The weapons appeared to be organic technology, grown rather than manufactured, using techniques that suggested a civilization far more advanced than either humans or Vicani. More disturbing was the discovery of communication nodes embedded within each weapon system. These devices had been transmitting data continuously since the rebellion began, sending detailed reports about Vicani military capabilities, political structures, and technological weaknesses to unknown recipients somewhere beyond the edge of explored space. Queen Zarathes convened an emergency session of the expanded Imperial Council, which now included Zorathi representatives for the first time in 20 years. War Chief Thakmor attended via quantum communication link, his fierce features displaying obvious concern as Dr. Vasquez presented her analysis of the alien technology. The implications were staggering. The Zorathi rebellion had been orchestrated not by the rebels themselves, but by an unknown species that was using the conflict to gather intelligence about the region's dominant powers. Every battle, every tactical response, every diplomatic maneuver had been monitored and analyzed by entities whose motives remained completely mysterious. General Korath, who had initially opposed the diplomatic approach, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of admitting that military action alone would have been catastrophically inadequate. If the Vicani had simply crushed the rebellion as planned, they would have eliminated the very evidence that revealed the true threat facing their empire. Marcus studied the biological components that Dr. Vasquez had extracted from the weapons, using his xenobiology background to analyze their structure and function. What he found challenged his understanding of how life could evolve. The organic technology showed signs of deliberate engineering at the genetic level, suggesting a species that had achieved complete mastery over biological systems. The communication nodes were even more sophisticated. They incorporated quantum entanglement principles that allowed instantaneous communication across galactic distances, technology that both humans and Vicani had theorized but never successfully implemented. Whoever had created these devices possessed scientific capabilities that made even the mighty Vicani Empire look primitive by comparison. Queen Zarathes faced a decision that would define her reign and possibly determine the survival of both the Vicani Empire and human civilization. The evidence suggested that they were being observed and evaluated by a species with the technology to destroy them all if they were found wanting. The question was whether to treat this as a threat to be defended against or an opportunity for contact with a vastly superior civilization. Marcus found himself thinking about humanity's own first contact protocols, which emphasized peaceful communication and cultural exchange over military posturing. But those protocols had been developed for contact with species of roughly equal technological development, not beings who could manipulate matter at the quantum level and travel instantly across galactic distances. The debate in the council chamber was intense and far-reaching. Some advisors argued for immediate military preparation, mobilizing every available resource to defend against a potential invasion by technologically superior enemies. Others suggested that any military response would be futile against beings capable of creating the weapons they had discovered. Thakmor surprised everyone by proposing a third option. The Zorathi had ancient legends about skywatchers who had visited their world centuries ago, beings of immense power who had observed their warrior culture before departing without explanation. If these were the same entities, their interest might be anthropological rather than military. This possibility opened up entirely new lines of speculation. Perhaps the advanced species was conducting some form of galactic survey, studying the development of younger civilizations to understand the patterns of technological and social evolution. The rebellion might have been engineered as a test of how the region's powers would respond to crisis and whether they were capable of cooperation rather than just conquest. Marcus proposed an experiment that built on the diplomatic success they had already achieved. Instead of preparing for war or hiding from superior technology, they could send a message directly through the communication nodes. If the unknown species was indeed studying them, Perhaps it was time to acknowledge their presence and request direct contact. The suggestion triggered another wave of debate. Revealing their knowledge of the surveillance could be seen as aggressive or threatening by the Watchers. On the other hand, pretending ignorance might be insulting to beings who clearly possess the technology to monitor their every move and conversation. Queen Zarathus made the decision based on the same principles that had guided her approach to the Zarathi rebellion. Honesty and direct communication had achieved better results than deception or force. If they were dealing with beings advanced enough to manipulate galactic politics for their own purposes, perhaps those beings would respect straightforward acknowledgement of the situation. The message they composed was carefully crafted to demonstrate both intelligence and peaceful intentions. It acknowledged the discovery of the surveillance technology, while expressing gratitude for the indirect lesson in cooperation that the engineered crisis had provided. Most importantly, it requested direct contact and offered to share information about human and Vicani civilizations in exchange for knowledge about the Watcher's own culture and goals. Dr. Vasquez modified one of the communication nodes to broadcast their message, using the same quantum entanglement principles that the devices employed for their surveillance reports. The transmission was sent simultaneously from monitoring stations throughout the former conflict zone, ensuring that it would reach its intended recipients regardless of their location in the galaxy. The response came faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours of their transmission, new signals began arriving through the communication network. But instead of text or audio messages, the Watchers sent holographic data packages that contained vast amounts of information about galactic history, technological principles, and the development of hundreds of different civilizations. The data revealed that the unknown species called themselves the Gardeners, an ancient civilization that had been studying and occasionally guiding younger species for millions of years. They were indeed conducting anthropological research, but with purposes that extended far beyond simple curiosity. According to the historical records they shared, the galaxy went through periodic cycles of expansion and contraction, driven by the rise and fall of dominant civilizations. The Gardeners had survived multiple such cycles by learning to work with rather than against these natural patterns of development. Their intervention in the Zarathi rebellion had been designed to test whether the current generation of spacefaring species was capable of cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution. Too many promising civilizations had destroyed themselves through endless wars and resource conflicts, leaving empty worlds and dead systems in their wake. The Vicani Empire's willingness to negotiate rather than simply conquer, combined with human diplomatic innovations and Zarathi warrior honor, adapting to new circumstances, had demonstrated exactly the kind of flexibility and wisdom that the Gardeners hoped to find in younger species. The message concluded with an invitation that stunned everyone who received it. The Gardeners offered to share advanced technologies and scientific knowledge with species that proved capable of managing power responsibly. But the offer came with conditions that would require fundamental changes in how both humans and Vicani approached their relationship with the galaxy. As Marcus and Zarathus reviewed the Gardeners' proposal in their private chambers, both of them understood that they stood at a crossroads that would determine the future of their civilizations. The choices they made in the coming days would echo across the galaxy for generations to come, potentially ushering in an age of unprecedented cooperation and advancement, or missing the opportunity entirely if they failed to rise to the challenge. The Gardeners' conditions were as challenging as their offer was generous. To gain access to their advanced technologies and galactic community, the regional powers would need to establish a true confederation based on equality and mutual respect, rather than conquest and submission. Every species in Vicani space would need to be given the choice between full membership in the new alliance or complete independence. To pursue their own path, Queen Zarathus spent sleepless nights studying the historical examples that the Gardeners had shared. Civilizations that had successfully made the transition to confederation status had unlocked technologies that allowed them to reshape worlds, cure diseases that had plagued them for millennia, and explore regions of space that were currently beyond imagination. But the failures were equally instructive. Species that had attempted to maintain old patterns of dominance while adopting Gardener technologies had inevitably destroyed themselves, usually within a few generations. The advanced tools required levels of cooperation and wisdom that could not coexist with traditional conquest-based empires. Marcus found himself at the center of planning sessions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Representatives from dozens of species were arriving at the capital world to participate in negotiations that would determine the political structure of an entire galactic region. His role as the Queen's human consort had evolved into something approaching that of an interspecies diplomatic coordinator. The challenges were immense. Some species had been enemies for centuries, nursing grievances that predated Vicani conquest. Others had developed such different approaches to communication and social organization that meaningful dialogue seemed impossible. The Krillian hive minds thought in terms of collective consciousness, while the solitary Nethek considered any form of cooperation to be a violation of individual autonomy. War Chief Thakmor proved to be an unexpected ally in the Confederation negotiations. His experience with both traditional Zorathi independence and Vicani occupation gave him unique insights into the benefits and limitations of different governmental approaches. More importantly, his warrior culture's emphasis on honor and direct communication helped bridge gaps between species that might otherwise have remained mired in diplomatic subtleties. The first major breakthrough came when the Krillian delegation proposed a radical solution to the problem of diverse communication styles. Instead of trying to force every species into the same negotiation format, they suggested creating multiple parallel discussion tracks that allowed different groups to work in ways that suited their particular natures. The hive minds could engage in direct consciousness sharing with species that possessed similar capabilities, while individualistic cultures could maintain traditional diplomatic protocols. Most importantly, mixed working groups would allow species with complementary abilities to collaborate on specific issues while respecting their fundamental differences. Marcus watched these discussions with growing amazement at the complexity of interspecies politics. His background in xenobiology had prepared him to understand different physiologies and communication methods, but the cultural and philosophical differences between species proved even more challenging to navigate. Queen Zarathus's blindness continued to be an unexpected advantage in the multinational environment. Her inability to see the visual cues that might bias her toward certain species allowed her to focus entirely on the content and logic of different proposals. She became known for her ability to identify common ground between seemingly incompatible positions. The negotiation process took months, but gradually a structure emerged that satisfied the gardener's requirements while addressing the legitimate concerns of all participating species. The new Galactic Confederation would be based on voluntary membership, with each species maintaining autonomy over their internal affairs while cooperating on matters of mutual interest such as defense, trade, and scientific research. The Vicani Empire would be dissolved, with individual Vicani worlds choosing whether to join the Confederation as independent members or form their own sub-alliance within the larger structure. Species that had been conquered would be given immediate recognition as sovereign entities with full voting rights in Confederation decisions. Most controversially, the Confederation would be governed by a rotating council system that prevented any single species from dominating the alliance. Leadership positions would be shared based on expertise and consensus rather than military power or economic influence. The signing ceremony for the Confederation charter took place on a neutral world that had been specially prepared for the historic occasion. Representatives from 43 different species gathered to witness the formal establishment of the first truly voluntary interspecies government in galactic history. Marcus stood beside Queen Zarathus as she added her signature to the document that would transform her from an empress ruling conquered territories into an elected representative of the Vicani people. Her skin displayed the complex patterns that he had learned to associate with profound emotional significance, colors that shifted between the grief of letting go of an old way of life and the excitement of embracing unprecedented possibilities. The gardeners marked the occasion by revealing themselves for the first time in centuries. Their representative was a being of impossible beauty, with a form that seemed to shift between states of matter, while radiating an aura of ancient wisdom and benevolent power. When it spoke, its words appeared directly in the consciousness of every listener, transcending language barriers and species differences. The message was simple but profound. The younger species had demonstrated the wisdom and cooperation necessary to join the galactic community. Technologies that had been theoretical dreams just months earlier would now become available to help solve problems, ranging from environmental restoration to interstellar travel. But the greatest gift was not technological. The gardeners revealed the locations of other Confederation governments throughout the galaxy, opening up possibilities for contact and cooperation with civilizations that had already made the transition to peaceful coexistence. As the ceremony concluded and representatives began planning the practical implementation of their new government, Marcus and Zarathes found themselves standing together on an observation deck, looking out at stars that now seemed closer and more welcoming than ever before. Their marriage had begun as a diplomatic arrangement between two very different species, but it had evolved into something that neither of them could have anticipated. They had not just learned to love each other, they had discovered that their differences could create possibilities that neither could achieve alone. The confederation that grew from their partnership would face countless challenges in the years ahead. Different species would continue to disagree about fundamental questions of ethics, governance, and social organization. Economic and territorial disputes would require careful mediation to prevent them from escalating into conflicts. But the foundation had been established for a new kind of civilization, one based on cooperation rather than conquest, understanding rather than submission. The blind alien queen and her human husband had not just found love across the vast gulf between their species. They had built a bridge that would allow countless others to make the same journey. As they watched the first mixed-species exploration vessels departing for unknown regions of the galaxy, both Marcus and Zarathes understood that their greatest adventure was just beginning. They had helped create a confederation that could grow and evolve for millennia, adapting to new challenges while maintaining the principles of equality and mutual respect that had made its formation possible. The universe was vast and full of wonders that they could barely imagine, but they would explore it together, each bringing their unique perspectives to the greatest collaborative endeavor in galactic history. Their love story had become the foundation for something far greater than either had dreamed possible when they first spoke across the void between their worlds.